my name's Mucho Guapo, and today we're going to be doing Unit 1 of AP Biology, the Chemistry of Life. In this video, we're going to be going over the whole unit, and we're going to be going over the following lessons. We're going to be going over water, its properties, the basic elements in biology, macromolecules, and the properties, structure, and function of those macromolecules. And then at the end, we'll be doing some multiple choice questions regarding each of these topics. So let's start off with water and its properties. So the main objective with this is to explain the properties of water and how they result from water's polarity and the hydrogen bonding within water. Into the next slides. So we have to start with the three main bondings in biology. Let's start with hydrogen bonding. So hydrogen bonding forms between hydrogen and a negatively charged atom, such as oxygen, fluorine, or nitrogen. And because of hydrogen's slight positive charge, it forms a weak bond to a highly electronegative atom. Some examples are listed here. And hydrogen bonding is one of the main reasons for the unique properties that water has, which we'll get into later. Next, we have ionic bonding. So ionic bonding is when electrons are completely transferred from one atom to another. So, for example, in the compound sodium chloride, sodium is a metal and chlorine is a nonmetal. And what's happening is sodium is giving its one electron in its outer valence shell to chlorine. And this is a complete transfer. And ionic bonds are extremely strong and are difficult to break, which is why sodium chloride takes great amounts of energy to break apart. And you might ask, well, doesn't salt dissolve in water? And yes, it does. But that's another one of the unique properties that water has, and which we'll get into later. Finally, we have covalent bonding, the most common bonding. So this is when electrons are shared between two atoms. So this means that it's not like ionic bonding where electrons are completely transferred from the metal to the non-metal. Instead, electrons are shared. So both atoms are satisfying their valency with those atoms. So covalent bonding can be either polar or nonpolar, meaning that if it's polar, then the electronegativities of the two atoms are different. For example, in water, we'll get into water later, but basically, hydrogen is slightly less electronegative than oxygen, and because of that, oxygen has a more affinity to electrons, which results in the electrons going more towards the oxygen, making oxygen slightly more negative, and results in hydrogen being slightly positive, which results in a lot of the unique properties that water has. If the electronegativities are the same, meaning that both of the atoms are the same, such as Cl2, then the covalent bond is nonpolar. So nonpolar covalent bonds are most commonly found in diatomic molecules. So nitrogen, so N2, O2, Cl2, and I2 are some examples of nonpolar covalent bonds. So before we move on to the properties of water, we have to talk a little bit about pH. So pH, so for every solution, there's meaning a substance dissolved in a solvent, there's a ratio of the concentration of hydrogen/hydronium ions to hydroxide ions. So this ratio determines the pH of the solution. So the equation for pH is the negative logarithm of the H plus ions. Now this isn't, you don't really need to know this, but I thought I'd throw it in there because it's important to know when we get into later units. So the pH scale is actually directly inverse to the pOH scale. So when the pH scale and the pOH scale goes from 0 to 14, and a pOH of 14 is the same as the pH of 0, which is a reference that you can make because the pOH and the pH will always add up to 14. So now let's talk about the properties of water. So water has many unique properties that are due to its polarity and hydrogen bonding. So if I just draw, so we have a little drawing here of some water molecules. So you can see how due to the higher electronegativity of oxygen compared to hydrogen, oxygen is slightly more negative as it takes more of those electrons, and hydrogen becomes slightly positive. This results in hydrogen bonds forming between the hydrogen, the positive side of a water, and the oxygen, the negative side of water, as positive and negatives attract. Now these hydrogen bonds allow water to have high amounts of cohesion. So if you ever tried the penny dropper lab in your school, where you tried to drop as many water droplets onto a penny, you see how a lot can go onto the penny before it spills, and that's due to these hydrogen bonds. So so the polarity of water allows it to have this bent shape, which allows for some other properties as well. So water has a very high specific heat, meaning that it takes a lot more energy to increase the temperature of water, and this is due to these hydrogen bonds. You need to put more energy to separate these water molecules because of these hydrogen bonds. And because of its polarity, water is extremely good as a biological solvent against hydrophilic compounds, such as carbohydrates, which we'll get onto later. So before we get into the biological macromolecules, we have to talk about the elements that make up most biological macromolecules. So the main elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, some macromolecules, such as proteins and nucleic acids, have nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur as part of its composition. So carbon, out of all these elements, however, carbon is the most important. And it's really because of the fact that carbon has 4 missing valence electrons, which allows it to make 4 covalent bonds. And it has a tetrahedral shape, which we'll talk about later. Its property of making 4 covalent bonds allows for a lot of different structures to be made, such as rings, which you can find in sugars, such as glucose and fructose, and chains, which you can see here, which is a fatty acid, and fatty acids are used in lipids. So now let's talk about macromolecules and their properties. The College Board wants us to describe the properties of the monomers and the types of bonds that connect the monomers in the macromolecules. So the main vocabulary in this unit are polymers, monomers, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. To start off, let's talk about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates have monomers known as monosaccharides, which can be monosaccharides such as glucose, fructose, galactose, which then can be put together in long chains to make polysaccharides, such as cellulose, starch, glycogen. Now these are some examples, and you can see how you can take something like the glucose, for example, glucose and fructose, and combine them to make polysaccharides. There are also disaccharides as well, such as sucrose and lactose, and they serve different functions depending on what carbohydrate you're talking about. Some general properties about carbohydrates are that they are very soluble in water, as mentioned before, and that their general formula go as CX and in parentheses H2OX. X just means, I'll show you. So if I had C6 So the x in this situation is equal to 6, for example. Using our formula here, then I can write H2O, and we can write the number 6. If we multiply this out, then this is C6H12O6. And this is glucose. Moving on. Some monomers in carbohydrates are glucose, fructose, which are mostly used for quick energy. So these sugars are quickly absorbed into our bloodstream, which are used for quick energy. Higher level carbohydrates, such as starch, cellulose, and glycogen, are mainly used for energy storage. Specifically starch and glycogen. Starch is used. If starch and glycogen are both used to store energy. Specifically, starch is used in plants and glycogen is used in animals. And cellulose, it's actually used structurally to make the cell walls of plant cells. Next, let's move on to lipids. So, the monomers of lipids are glycerol and fatty acids. So, if you look at this picture here, glycerol has the glycerol and the fatty acid combine together through dehydration synthesis, and these structures are then put together to make higher level polymers of lipids, such as triglycerides and phospholipids, which we have right under that. Right under the glycerol and the fatty acid, we have a triglycerol. So, the main character trait of lipids are that they're insoluble in water. So, biological macromolecules that are insoluble in water are typically lipids. So, unlike carbohydrates, they also don't come in repeating series of monomers. So, if we go back to carbohydrates, we can see how starch, glycogen, and cellulose are all built using multiple chains of monomers. So these are maybe glucose rings, which are then combined through dehydration synthesis to make long chains. However, in lipids, the polymers are not long chains. Rather, they're maybe three chains through ester linkages, as shown in picture B in the triglycerol. So, similar to carbohydrates, lipids are also used for energy storage, but they're typically used for long-term energy storage and not short-term. And lipids also are also fats, which in animals can be used as insulation to keep us warm. And also, lipids, specifically phospholipids, are used in cell membranes, as shown here, and the phospholipid bilayer of most cells. Our cells have a phospholipid bilayer. Let's move on to proteins. So proteins monomers are amino acids, and 20 different amino acids exist. You don't necessarily need to know all of them, but just know that these amino acids combine through peptide bonds, which are formed between the amino acids to form the peptides and the peptides/proteins. So proteins polymers can actually have many structures, which lead to many different functions. Proteins have the most functions out of any macromolecule. So, some examples of protein structures are secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So, two basic secondary structures are the alpha helix and the beta sheet. The alpha helix and the beta sheet are then combined to make the tertiary structure. And then tertiary structures are combined to make quaternary structures. Then we can go on to the types of protein functions. So some proteins are enzymes, meaning that they speed up chemical reactions. They act as catalysts. Some proteins are defensive proteins. They act against disease. So they're antibodies. So antibodies in our body are proteins. And they also help with storage of amino acids, and they also help transport substances through cells. So in the cell membrane, there are transport proteins in which substances can pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Finally, the last biological macromolecule are nucleic acids. So, nucleic acids, as in their name, are slightly acidic, and they contain large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. So, nucleic acids, as shown here in the left-hand picture, are made up of 3 parts. They're made up of sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. So the nitrogenous bases include adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and uracil. Specifically, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine are found in DNA, while adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil are found in RNA. In DNA, nucleic acids store DNA stores genetic information, which controls how tall we are, the color of our hair, etc. In RNA, nucleic acids have a different role. RNA actually retrieves the information from the DNA, which allows the RNA to send messages to the parts of our cells to make proteins, which we'll cover in the next unit. So that's it. We have just gone over everything you need to know for Unit 1 of AP Biology. So now let's go over some practice questions which applies some of the knowledge that we've learned through this video. So the first question that we have is, which property of water allows it to move upward from the roots of the tree to its leaves? So let's think about this question. Let's look at the answer choices. So it's specific heat, the heat of vaporization, cohesion, and the solvent of life. So which property allows it to move upward from roots to the tree to the leaves? So water sticks to each other and actually sticks to the roots and travels up the tree. So which of these choices mentions water sticking to each other? It's C, cohesion. And cohesion just means that the water is able to stick to each other and move along up the tree. Let's lead you to question 2. There are several emergent properties of water that contribute its powerful effect on living organisms. These emerging properties are mostly due to the abundance of water on Earth, the hydrogen bonds linking water molecules together, water's ability to moderate pH, the buffering ability of water. So this is an easy question to solve. So we know that the properties of water that contribute to its powerful effect are due to its hydrogen bonds and its polarity. So we just need to pick the choice that says either its hydrogen bonds or polarity, which is choice B. Let's move to question 3, which states, which type of chemical bond involves the transfer of electrons from one atom to another, resulting in oppositely charged ions that are attracted to each other? So there's covalent bond, ionic bond, hydrogen bond, and van der Waals interactions. We can immediately cross off D because it's not a chemical bond. And let's go through the A, B, and C. So this is saying a transfer of electrons. A covalent bond, by definition, is sharing electrons, so we can cross that out. Hydrogen bond is not does not create oppositely charged ions that are attracted to each other and does not transfer electrons, so that's crossed out. Ionic bond, however, is, by definition, a transfer of electrons from typically a metal to a nonmetal. So it's the answer to this question. Let's go through question 4. Which of the following molecules is a carbohydrate? So palmitic acid, collagen, insulin, and lactose. So let's go through these one by one. Palmitic acid. So typically, when you want to look for a carbohydrate, it ends in the suffix OSE. So glucose, fructose, sucrose, and we just need to find the choice that has one of those. And D is that choice, and D is the answer, but I'll go through why A, B, and C are wrong. Collagen is a protein, which is clearly not a carbohydrate. Insulin is also a protein, and palmitic acid is a fatty acid, and fatty acids are typically found in lipids, so we can cross that choice off. Collagen is a protein that's found in our skin. Insulin is a protein that's made by our pancreas to regulate our glucose levels in our blood. So we can cross out A, B, and C, and we're left with D, lactose, which is the answer. And finally, question 5. Use the diagram below to answer questions 5 through 6. Which of the following part of the diagram is showing a monomer? So this question is asking us to identify which of the following structures are monomers. So A is a long chain of what is, I'm assuming, hydrocarbons, and B is one single hydrocarbon. C is a water molecule that is being put in and through hydrolysis, and D is a water molecule that's being taken out, typically used in dehydration synthesis. And so we can automatically remove C and D. And because B is being added on to A, we can reasonably assume that B is the answer. B is the monomer. Thank you. You have now finished Unit 1 of AP Biology. Thank you for watching. Visit our Discord server, the Wattsaid Foundation. It will be linked in the description below. It's been Mucho Guapo. Thank you.